James Bultema, your new president of the Grant Association, and I want to welcome you to our very first video newsletter. This is something that is important to us in the organization and to me personally, to get the word out to you about what's going on at the Grant Library and in the Grant world. So each quarter we hope to bring to you a interesting video newsletter, not a printed one, so you'll see and visualize everything that's going on in the world of Grant. So here we go with our first edition.
Greetings from the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library here in Starkville, Mississippi. I'm Ann Marshall. I am the new Executive Director, and I am really glad to be talking to you on this video newsletter. I just wanted to give you several updates about what we've been doing here at the library in the last couple of months. First of all, we've been welcoming a lot more visitors since the pandemic. We've had over 2,000 visitors so far this year, which is a welcome development since our numbers were way down during COVID times. Another thing that we've been doing is forging new ties with other presidential sites around the country. My assistant Eddie Rangel, who many of you may be familiar with, and I attended the White House Historical Association Summit in Dallas, Texas in March, where we met with lots of different people from different presidential sites across the nation. And so we're looking forward to forging new cooperative relationships with presidential sites all over the country. We also were able to take part in the Grant Memorial Association celebration in New York City in April. Another thing that we are doing to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Grant's birth is sending out a traveling exhibit that is traveling around to different Grant sites around the nation. So it might be showing up at a location near you. You might want to check it out. But these are just a few of the things that we have going on at the library. There are many more. So if you want to keep up with us, be sure that you are following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. See you next time.
Lot number 106. They probably will never be sold publicly again. That is what we are selling here. They are that important. And just as art objects themselves, they're 90% guns, 95% guns, carved ivory, engraved by Louis D. Nimsky, really, as we say, a virtuoso of firearms engraving, one of the fathers, the best 19th century American engravers. All right, let's get started. Lot number 106, National Treasure, documented L.D. Nimsky, master engraved. Remington new model percussion revolvers with the patriotic eagle and the relief carved grips, fresh as the day is long. 800,000 bid, 850,000. When you go 850,000, where it got to be 850, 950, and now $1 million. Got to be 1 million. Yeah. $1 million and now 1.1. The phones are in. The million got to be 1.2. Got to be 1.2 million. Yep. 1.2 and 1.3. Got to be 1.4 million. What do you go? 1.4 million. The bid is on the floor. 2.4 and now 2.5, and now 2.5 and now 2.6 million, 2.6 and now 2.7, 0.5 and now 3.6, sir, 3.6 and now 3.7, 4.4 million is bid on the floor, got to be 4.5. Fair warning, sold at 4.4 million. Thank you for that.
Hi, with me today is Nick Sacco. He's a park ranger with the Ulysses S. Grant National Historical Society in St. Louis. He's going to talk to us about Grant and Whitehaven.
Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. We are a unit of the National Park Service. We are located in St. Louis, Missouri. The park here, we have a number of things we try to do with our mission. Obviously, Ulysses S. Grant lived in and owned the Whitehaven estate at different points in his life. From 1854 to 59, he actually lived at this house. He lived with his wife, Julia, their children, and Julia's in-laws all together at the Whitehaven estate. And Grant then, after the Civil War, took ownership of the Whitehaven estate and owned it for almost 20 years from the end of the Civil War until shortly before his death in 1885. Now, another facet of the mission here is that this was the childhood home of Julia Dent Grant, the Whitehaven estate that the park manages here. Julia grew up at Whitehaven, and in her personal memoir, she talks about living at Whitehaven and her experiences here. And then the third important facet is the history of slavery. Whitehaven was a plantation before the Civil War. Julia's family, the Dents, enslaved upwards of 30 African Americans who did almost all the labor on this property. So it's really kind of a three-pronged mission, talking about Ulysses S. Grant's life and experiences here in St. Louis, but his wife Julia and her family, and the enslaved people as well here at the property. So we've been here since 1989. The park's existed for a little over 30 years. We have a 22-minute video on Ulysses S. Grant's life. We do tours on a daily basis of the Whitehaven estate. And we have a museum with 6 permanent exhibits and galleries inside of it about Ulysses and Julia's relationship and Grant's life and legacy as General and President of the United States.
And Nick, could you tell us what brought Grant to Whitehaven for the first time?
Grant, he was an officer with the U.S. Army stationed at Jefferson Barracks. Jefferson Barracks is one of the largest military posts in the country. In 1843, when Grant finishes at West Point and is then sent here to the barracks. So Jefferson Barracks is along the banks of the Mississippi River, and it's about 5 miles south of the Whitehaven estate. So it's one of those small world moments. One of Grant's best friends at West Point had been a fellow cadet, Julia Dent, Grant's brother, Frederick T. Dent. So Fred Dent and Grant were very close at West Point, and Fred invited Ulysses to come out here and meet the rest of the family while stationed at Jefferson Barracks. So Grant will accept that invitation, and for several months he comes out once or twice a week to meet with the Dent family and get a fresh home-cooked meal at Whitehaven. Julia herself, she'd been away. She lived with some friends in downtown St. Louis through the winter, but in early 1844, when she came back to Whitehaven, Grant says that at that point, he came out to Whitehaven almost every day after Julia came back, and they began their relationship here.
In one of the many historical societies that dot our country, Paul Brisbois from the Shirley Historical Society in Massachusetts was diligently cataloging artifacts in the collection when he came across a box of glass negatives. While going through them, he noticed they were mostly images of anonymous people from the 1880s, something he sees every day. But Paul's a curious fellow, so he dug deeper into the pile and noticed under the glass plate negative a paper envelope with the inscription that took his breath away. It said, General Grant, photo sculpture, 1867. How surprised he was when he carefully pulled out 3 fading and worn out glass plate negatives of General Ulysses S. Grant in uniform. What Paul had uncovered was 3 extremely rare and unpublished original images of General Grant taken in 1867, posing for a photo sculpture, a new invention from the time. More on that in a minute. The provenance of these rare negatives begins in 1867, when 24-year-old Steele MacKay, who would later become one of the most famous actors and theater producers of his generation, became aware of the process of photo sculpture, invented 7 years earlier in 1860 by Parisian artist Francis Willem. Borrowing $15,000, but that's $300,000 in today's money, to invest in the process with 2 local photographers, Houston and Kurtz of New York City. Using 24 cameras equally spaced in a circle, the photographers could capture in one snap of the lens a 360-degree view of Grant to create a negative from which molds could be made to construct a bronze statue. Grant was one of the Houston and Kurtz's first subjects. You can see 2 of the cameras in the background. The metal stand you see with long projecting prongs held the subject's head steady for the long camera exposure, taking up to 12 seconds. Although statues were made of Admiral Farragut and Horace Greeley, it was Grant that the fledgling company hoped would bring them fame and fortune. Unfortunately, ruin came when a workman stole the bronze master copy of the Grant statue, from which future copies could have been made, and simply because they had very few sales. The business failed, but for us Grant enthusiasts of today, the negative survived. A few days ago, I thought the story ended here, but it doesn't. As I was writing this article, I told another Grant board member and Grant collector, John Samson, of these unpublished negatives I just came across. When he saw the photographs, he couldn't believe it. Sitting right above his desk was one of the extremely rare statuettes made from these photographs. The Shirley Historical Society had been searching for the finished product, but had no luck in finding one. I too have never seen one, but here it is with the original dates neatly inscribed on the beautiful bronze of General Grant. Through the diligent work of Paul Bresbala, these negatives were rediscovered and now can be seen by future generations and now grace our video newsletter. With me today is Brother Rogers. He's the Director of Programs and Communications at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Brother, can you tell me why you joined the Ulysses S. Grant Association and what brought you to have an interest in Grant?
Well, I have to admit that Dr. John Marzalak suggested that I join the Ulysses S. Grant Association because he knew I had read a number of Grant biographies and got very interested in Grant because Mississippi State became the home of his papers. So I have to give Dr. Marzalak credit for encouraging me to join the Grant Association.
Being a member of the Grant Association, has that met your expectations?
Well, I have to say that my expectations have been more than met joining the Grant Association. The good things that I've been able to experience were things that I never had even imagined. I've been able to meet authors such as, Ron Chernow or Ron White, who wrote definitive biographies of Grant. I was able to meet somebody like Frank Scaturo, who almost single-handedly saved Grant's tomb up in New York City. Recently, when we were in Starkville, I got to meet Stuart McLaurin, who runs the White House Historical Association, not to mention the trips that have come as a result of being in the Grant Association. The trip we took to West Point was like no other trip I've had in my life.
I understand you attended the Grant Association meeting in New York City at West Point last year. Can you tell the members listening what that was like?
Well, the trip to New York was fantastic for anybody who likes Ulysses S. Grant. We were treated like VIPs at the dedication of the Ulysses S. Grant statue there on the grounds of the United States Military Academy. Of course, that's the only time I've even been to the Military Academy, and the view of the Hudson River is unparalleled. The library there at West Point brought out artifacts from Grant's time at West Point. We also, of course, were able to take a bus up to the Grant Cottage in the Adirondacks, where he finished writing his memoir and where he died. And of course, the Grant's Cottage was so interesting because everything there was exactly as it was the day he died. There were no replicas. It was all original furnishings. And then the last day, we were at Grant's tomb for a special ceremony in Manhattan. So I never would have been able to do anything like any of those three opportunities. And that was just one trip and one annual meeting that just blew my mind. It was so much fun.
Brother, can you tell me some of the positives of being a member of the Grant Association?
Well, every time I go to a meeting of the Ulysses S. Grant Association, I meet somebody new. I've met John Y. Simon's wife. I've met so many interesting people who always help make the event so much fun, because you never know who you're going to run into who you're going to meet, but you know this, if you come to the annual meeting of the Grant Association, you're going to meet somebody special and you're going to have a fabulous time.
For this interview of Grant's World, we're going to hear from John Samson about Grant's memoirs. John Samson is a lifelong resident of St. Louis who retired from the St. Louis County Police Department as a sergeant after serving for 33 years. He has been a member of the Ulysses S. Grant Association since the 1980s and is currently a member of our board of directors. And I should add, the membership chair. He is also an avid collector of grant-related items and has over 500 books and approximately 100 original images of Grant, as well as numerous busts and statues. He has conducted hundreds of tours at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historical Site, Whitehaven, and gives grant-related talks in the St. Louis area. So here's John Samson.
Thanks, Jim. I'd like to talk a little bit about the process of Grant writing his memoirs. In the summer of 1884, Grant found himself in dire financial straits due to the collapse of the Wall Street firm Grant and Ward. He looked around for ways to generate some income and repay his creditors. He accepted an offer from the Century magazine to be paid $500 each for 4 articles he wrote about his Civil War battles. He then decided to write his memoirs after having resisted the idea for years. He was offered contracts by both Century Magazine Company and Charles Webster and Company, with whom Mark Twain was associated. Grant selected Webster to publish the memoirs and began writing them in November of 1884. From that time until he passed away on July 23rd, 1885, Grant engaged in a race against death to finish the memoirs before he succumbed to his terminal oral cancer. He finished the memoirs until just a few days before he died. Webster and Company sold the 2-volume set of the memoirs by subscription, sending 10,000 sales agents out into the field. Many of them were Union war veterans who wore their uniforms. They went door to door selling the memoirs. The memoirs were originally bound in 5 different bindings. The cheapest and by far the most common is the fine cloth, commonly called the shoulder strap edition, which sold for $7 per set. Next in line was the full sheepskin edition, which sold for $9 per set. The fine half Morocco leather binding sold for $11 per set. The full Turkey Morocco leather sold for $18 per set. And for those people who could afford it, there was a tree calf leather edition, which sold for $25 per set. The first printing of the memoirs resulted in 350,000 sets being sold, which netted Grant's widow, Julia, about $450,000, or about $13.5 million in today's money. The 2 most recent editions of the memoirs are both annotated. The first one was prepared by the association's own John Marzalek, David Nolan, and Louis Gallo. The other one was prepared by Elizabeth Samet, who is on the staff of the United States Military Academy. In 1895, the Century Company published a partially annotated edition of the memoirs, which was assisted with by Grant's oldest son, Fred. The memoirs are an enduring testimonial to Grant's greatness and exemplify the qualities of simplicity, honesty, and fairness. Anyone who cares to learn about the man, Ulysses S. Grant, should begin by reading the memoirs and then going to any of the excellent biographies that have been written about him for more information.
Well, thanks, John. That was very interesting. I just have a few questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So how have the memoirs been received by scholars and historians throughout history since when it was published?
From the publication date, the memoirs have been pretty much universally accepted as some of the finest American nonfiction writing. It has been compared to Caesar's Commentaries as the finest writings by a military man. Authors such as Gertrude Stein and Gore Vidal have said that it is great writing. Perhaps the greatest compliment came from Mark Twain, who published the memoirs, who said that he wished he wrote as well as Grant did in the memoirs.
So why do you think the memoirs are so highly regarded?
Most reviewers point to the simplicity of the writing, the lack of flowery speech, the honesty that pours forth from Grant's pen, his fairness to others. And the memoirs have been compared to his military writings. It's very clear. The prose is very simple, direct, and to the point.
I understand from my research that Grant really didn't want to talk about his time during the Civil War. At least he may have talked about it, but he didn't want to write about it. So
That's correct.
Yeah. So what changed his mind besides needing the money, or was that the only reason?
Well, that was the primary reason, but he discovered it when he wrote the Century Magazine articles that he really enjoyed it. Before this time, he had resisted all the offers to write any articles or to write his memoirs for a couple of reasons. First of all, he doubted his writing ability. Second of all, he rather innocently, I think, doubted whether the American people wanted to hear his story. Plus, the military aspects of his career were covered in Adam Badeau's 3-volume Military History of U.S. Grant. Grant made the statement more than once, it's all in Badeau's book, so he felt no reason to write about it. He also didn't want to detract from the sale of Badeau's 3-volume set by writing his memoirs. But like you said, once he was desperate for money, he changed his mind. Plus, discovering he enjoyed the writing, he went forth with it.
All right. Very interesting. John, I want to thank you a lot for taking the time to talk to our membership about the memoirs. I've seen your collection. It's amazing. And as the viewer can see behind you, you have many things in your Grant library. But once again, thanks, and we'll talk later.